The black emptiness of space stretched endlessly in every direction. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the diplomatic vessel Horizon, watching the stars through the main viewport. It was supposed to be a quiet patrol along the outer rim territories, far from any conflict zones, the kind of mission that let crews relax and catch up on reports. Everything changed when the distress signal came through. Lieutenant Amy Carter was the first to hear it. She was sitting at the communications station, half asleep during the boring night shift, when her console suddenly lit up with urgent red warnings. The signal was weak, broken by static and interference, but the desperation in the voice was unmistakable. "This is Karvathi Transport Vessel Morning Light. We are under attack. Repeat, we are under attack. The Zrelthian Empire has begun orbital bombardment of Vareth Prime. Thousands of civilians are trapped on the surface. The colony shields will fail within hours. We request immediate assistance. Please, anyone who can hear this, help us." Amy's hands moved quickly across her controls, trying to clean up the signal. She could hear the fear in the alien captain's voice, could hear explosions in the background. She turned to wake Commander Morrison, but he was already standing behind her, his face serious. "How far away are they?" Jake asked. Amy checked her instruments. "The signal is coming from about 6 light-years away. The colony world of Vareth Prime is in the Karvathi system. Sir, that's right in the middle of the war zone." Jake knew about the war. Everyone in the galaxy knew about it. The Zrelthian Empire had been expanding aggressively for the past 3 years, conquering peaceful species and taking their worlds. The Karvathi were farmers and artists, a species that believed in harmony and cooperation. They had no real military, no way to defend themselves against a ruthless empire. The Galactic Council had talked about intervention. They had held meetings and debates. They had issued statements of concern, but they had done nothing real, nothing that actually helped. The Zrelthians were powerful, and no one wanted to risk a larger war. "Can we reach them in time?" Jake asked. Amy shook her head. "Not us, sir. We're a diplomatic ship. Even at maximum speed, it would take us 2 days to get there. By then, it will be too late, and even if we could get there, we only have basic defensive weapons. The Zrelthians have a full battle fleet." The bridge crew had gathered now, everyone awake and listening. They all knew the math. They all knew what it meant. Those civilians were going to die, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Jake stood silent for a long moment, thinking. He had joined the Earth Defense Force 20 years ago because he believed in protecting people. He had transferred to diplomatic services because he thought words could solve more problems than weapons. But sometimes words weren't enough. "Send a priority message to Earth Command," Jake said finally. "Maximum encryption. Tell them we have a situation that requires the old protocols." His second officer, Lieutenant Ben Walsh, looked confused. "Sir, what old protocols?" Jake met his eyes. "Tell them to wake up the Sentinels." The bridge went completely quiet. Everyone knew what that word meant, even if most of them had never seen one. The Sentinels were legend, stories from before humanity joined the Galactic Council. Ancient war machines from a time when humans expected to fight for their survival among the stars. Amy recovered first. "Sir, those have been sealed for over 200 years. There are treaties. The Council made us agree to never use weapons of that level again." "The treaties say we won't use them for wars of aggression," Jake corrected. "This isn't aggression. This is answering a distress call. This is what we're supposed to do." He turned back to the viewport, watching the distant stars. Somewhere out there, people were dying. Children were crying. Families were holding each other, waiting for death to rain down from orbit. And the galaxy was doing nothing. "Send the message," Jake said quietly, "and pray that Earth Command agrees with me." The message went out on the fastest quantum channels, racing across light years in minutes. On Earth, in the middle of the night, alarms began sounding in military headquarters. Admirals were pulled from their beds. The Secretary of Defense was woken up with an urgent call. Within an hour, the message reached the one person who could make the final decision. President Linda Martinez sat in the Situation Room, surrounded by military advisors and cabinet members. On the screen in front of her was the distress call, translated into English. She listened to it 3 times. "How many civilians?" she asked. "Intelligence estimates between 50 and 70,000, her chief of staff replied. "Mostly families. The Karvathi don't maintain military installations. Vareth Prime is a farming colony. And the Galactic Council? They're still debating. The Velnari delegation wants to send observers. The Thruss want to issue a formal complaint. No one is talking about actual intervention. Linda closed her eyes. She had taken an oath when she became president. An oath to protect Earth and its interests. But she had also made a personal promise to herself, one she had never spoken aloud. She had promised that as long as she had power, she would never let innocent people die when she could do something about it. How long to deploy the Sentinels? She asked the Secretary of Defense. The Luna facility can be opened in 3 hours. Crew revival will take another 6 hours. They can launch within 12 hours of authorization. 12 hours. The shields on Vareth Prime would fail in 8. It would be close, impossibly close. But it might work. Open the vaults, Linda said. Wake them up. All of them. Her advisors exchanged worried looks. The Secretary of State leaned forward. Madam President, this will have serious diplomatic consequences. The Council will see this as a violation of our agreements. Some species will be frightened. We've spent 2 centuries building trust. Linda stood up, her decision made. Then they'll learn something about humanity. They'll learn that when someone calls for help, we answer. We don't debate. We don't form committees, we answer. Authorization code is Martinez Alpha 77. Execute immediately. On Luna, deep beneath the silver surface, vault doors that hadn't opened in centuries began to unlock. Lights flickered on in massive hangars, and in rows of suspended animation chambers. Men and women who had gone to sleep when humanity was young and afraid began to wake up. Captain Greg Palmer opened his eyes for the first time in 234 years. The medical bay was cold, and his body felt strange after centuries of sleep. A doctor was standing over him checking vital signs. Welcome back, Captain, the doctor said. We need you again. Greg sat up slowly, memories flooding back. The last battle he had fought. The treaty signing, the order to sleep, to wait until humanity needed its ancient guardians again. What's the situation? He asked, his voice rough. Civilian colony under attack. We're deploying in 8 hours. Greg smiled grimly. His hands remembered the controls. His mind remembered the connection. Somewhere in the hangar beyond, his sentinel was waiting. Warden 7, his partner, his weapon, his responsibility. Then let's not keep them waiting, he said, standing up. Time to show the galaxy what humans do best. The distress call continued to broadcast into empty space, growing weaker with each passing minute. But help was coming. The ancient machines were waking up. And the galaxy was about to remember why humanity's weapons had been sealed away in the first place. Not because they weren't effective, but because they were terrifying. Director Helen Price had never expected to use her security clearance for this. She had been appointed director of the Luna Historical Military Archive 5 years ago, thinking it would be a quiet job managing old records and giving tours to military historians. The facility was basically a museum, a reminder of humanity's violent past before they joined the galactic community. Now she was running through corridors that hadn't seen human footsteps in over 2 centuries, her security team struggling to keep up. The facility was massive, carved deep into Luna's rock. The outer sections held smaller equipment, old fighter craft and ground vehicles that belonged in museums. But the deeper sections, the ones that required presidential authorization to access, held something else entirely. Helen stopped in front of the main vault door. It was 10 meters tall and made of layered metals designed to withstand nuclear strikes. The control panel beside it looked ancient, with physical buttons and switches instead of touchscreens. Her hands were shaking as she entered the authorization codes. The locks disengaged with a deep grinding sound that echoed through the corridors. Dust fell from the ceiling. The door split down the middle and began to slide open, moving slowly on mechanisms that hadn't been used since humanity was still afraid of the dark between the stars. The hangar beyond was enormous, stretching away into darkness. As motion sensors detected their presence, lights began flickering on in sequence, revealing row after row of towering shapes. The Sentinels. Helen had seen pictures, of course. Everyone had. They were part of human history, taught in schools as examples of what humanity built when they thought they might have to fight for their survival. But pictures didn't capture the reality of standing in front of one. They were giants, each one standing nearly 50 meters tall. Their basic shape was humanoid, with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a central torso, but that's where the similarity to humans ended. Their armor was thick and scarred, painted in colors that had faded over the centuries. Each one carried weapons that looked oversized even for their massive frames. Kinetic cannons mounted on shoulders, plasma blades attached to forearms, missile pods built into their backs. But the most striking thing was their faces. Each sentinel had a faceplate that could almost pass for human, with optical sensors arranged like eyes and communication vents that looked like mouths. It made them seem alive even though they were powered down and dark. "How many are there?" one of Helen's security guards asked, his voice barely a whisper. 48, Helen replied. 12 are being deployed to Vareth Prime. The rest stay here as reserves. The medical bay was in a separate section of the facility, through another set of vault doors. This was where the pilots had been kept, sleeping in suspended animation chambers that kept them alive but frozen in time. The chambers were arranged in neat rows, each one connected to monitoring systems that had faithfully checked vital signs for over 200 years. Captain Greg Palmer was the first to wake. The revival process was carefully controlled, slowly bringing his body temperature up and restarting systems that had been dormant for centuries. Medical staff stood by with equipment ready, though the technology was so reliable that problems were rare. When Greg finally opened his eyes, he spent a moment staring at the ceiling, confused. His last memory was of lying down in the chamber after the treaty signing, following orders to sleep until humanity needed him again. That felt like yesterday. According to the display on his chamber, it had been 234 years. "Welcome back, Captain Palmer," a doctor said, helping him sit up. "Take it slow. Your muscles need a few minutes to remember how to work." Greg flexed his fingers, then his arms. Everything felt strange, like wearing someone else's body. But the memories were sharp. The training, the battles, the feeling of being connected to his sentinel. That hadn't faded at all. "Status report," Greg said, his voice rough from disuse. "Civilian colony under attack by hostile forces. The Galactic Council is not responding. We've been authorized to deploy 12 sentinels. You're leading the mission." Greg nodded slowly. It made sense. Before going into suspension, he had been the ranking sentinel pilot with 15 years of combat experience. If they were waking people up, they'd start with the best. Around him, other chambers were opening. Lieutenant Kevin Shaw, who had always been the best close combat pilot. Sergeant Nicole Hayes, whose accuracy with long-range weapons was legendary. One by one, the old guard was returning. They gathered in a briefing room that still had furniture from 2 centuries ago. Helen Price stood at the front, looking at a dozen men and women who had been born before her grandparents and who looked younger than she did. "The situation is straightforward," Helen began, displaying a tactical map. "The Karvathi colony of Vareth Prime is under attack by Zrelthian forces. Estimated civilian population is 60,000. The colony has basic shields that will fail within the next 6 hours. 18 Zrelthian warships are in orbit preparing for bombardment. Ground forces are already landing to secure strategic positions." She paused, looking at each pilot in turn. "The Galactic Council has done nothing. They're still debating. By the time they decide to act, everyone on that planet will be dead." Kevin raised his hand. "What's our authorization level?" "Full combat authorization." The President herself gave the order. "You are cleared to use any force necessary to protect the civilians and neutralize the Zrelthian threat." Greg stood up. "What about the treaties?" "The Council made humanity promise not to deploy sentinels except in defense of Earth itself." Helen smiled grimly. "The legal team found a technicality. The treaty says we can't use sentinels for wars of aggression or territorial expansion. It says nothing about humanitarian intervention. Technically, we're not breaking any rules." "Technically," Nicole repeated. "The Council is going to lose their minds when they find out." "Let them," Greg said. "We took an oath to protect people. Not just Earth people. All people. If the Council won't help, then we will." The walk to the hangar felt surreal. The pilots were dressed in neural interface suits, skin-tight garments covered in sensors and connection points. These suits allowed direct mental connection with the Sentinels, turning thought into action. The technology was old but proven. Nothing modern could match the speed and precision of a human mind directly controlling a war machine. Greg stopped in front of Warden 7. His Sentinel. They had fought together in the border wars, had survived battles that should have killed them both. The armor still showed scars from those fights, marks that the maintenance crews had decided to keep as a record of service. He climbed the access ladder built into the leg, reached the cockpit in the chest section, and settled into the pilot's seat. The moment he connected his suit to the interface ports, he felt the familiar rush of sensation. It was like his body suddenly became 50 meters tall and made of metal and weapons. The Sentinel's optical sensors became his eyes, giving him a 360-degree view of the hangar. The mechanical hands became his hands, capable of crushing steel or handling delicate objects with equal ease. The weapon systems became extensions of his will, ready to fire the instant he thought about it. Warden 7 online, Greg announced. All systems green. Around the hangar, other Sentinels were powering up. Their optical sensors glowed in the darkness. Their reactor cores hummed with building energy. They looked like sleeping giants waking from a very long dream. This is Director Price. Helen's voice came over the general channel. Carrier vessels are ready for immediate departure. The trip to Varath Prime will take 7 hours at maximum hyperspace speed. You'll arrive approximately 1 hour after the shields fail. Ground forces will be landing when you arrive. Your mission is to protect the civilians, eliminate the hostile ground forces, and provide cover while transport ships evacuate the population. What about the orbital fleet? Kevin asked. The carriers have their own weapons and fighter craft. They'll handle the ships. You focus on the ground. Greg checked his tactical display. 12 Sentinels against an unknown number of ground forces, in atmosphere with civilians to protect. It would be challenging, but that's what they had been built for. All units, this is Palmer, Greg announced. Remember your training. Stay mobile, watch your crossfire, and protect the civilians above everything else. We're not conquerors. We're guardians. Let's show the galaxy what that means. The Sentinels marched toward the loading bays, their footsteps shaking the ground. Behind them, Helen Price watched them go, wondering if she had just made history or started a war. Maybe both. The carrier vessels were waiting, massive rectangular ships designed for one purpose, getting Sentinels to combat zones. Each carrier could hold 4 Sentinels in its launch bays, secured for travel and ready for rapid deployment. As Greg's Sentinel was locked into position, he had a moment to think about what they were about to do. They were going to fly across the galaxy to fight people they had never met, to protect aliens they knew nothing about because someone had sent a distress call. And that, Greg realized, was exactly what made humanity special. Not their weapons, not their technology, but their willingness to answer when someone called for help, no matter how far away or how dangerous the situation. The carrier's engines powered up. The bay doors opened to reveal the hyperspace journey gave everyone time to think. Inside the carrier vessels, the Sentinel pilots sat in their cockpits, connected to their machines but in standby mode. They couldn't see outside during hyperspace travel. There was nothing to see except the strange colors and impossible geometries that human eyes weren't meant to process. So they waited, and they prepared. Captain Greg Palmer used the time to review intelligence reports on the Zrelthian Empire. What he read wasn't encouraging. The Zrelthians were a warrior culture that had been expanding aggressively for the past decade. They believed that strength was the only virtue that mattered, and they had conquered 7 peaceful species already. Their military technology was modern, built to fight against typical galactic defenses. The problem was that Sentinels weren't typical. They were older than most current military technology, built using principles that humanity had developed in isolation before joining the galactic community. While the galaxy had moved toward energy weapons and shield technology, humans had perfected kinetic weapons and composite armor. Different approaches, different strengths. Palmer, you getting the tactical updates? Kevin's voice came through the communication channel. Yeah, I'm seeing them. 18 warships in orbit. Ground forces estimated at 3,000 soldiers plus armor support. They've got walkers, heavy artillery, and atmospheric fighters. 3,000 against 12 of us. Those are pretty good odds, Greg smiled. Kevin had always been optimistic, even when they were young pilots facing their first real combat. Some things didn't change even after 2 centuries of sleep. Remember, our job isn't to fight everyone, Greg reminded him. Our job is to protect the civilians long enough to get them evacuated. We hold the line, we draw fire. We make the Zrelthians focus on us instead of the population centers. And if they don't want to focus on us, then we make them. Sentinels are pretty hard to ignore. Meanwhile, in orbit around Varath Prime, Commander Vrax the Merciless was growing impatient. The Karvathi shields were weakening right on schedule, but his sensors had detected multiple hyperspace signatures approaching the system. Someone was coming, though he couldn't identify who yet. Vrax was a veteran commander with 30 years of conquest experience. He had destroyed resistance forces on 6 worlds. He had bombarded cities that refused to surrender. The Carvathi were nothing special, just another weak species that would be absorbed into the Empire. His sensor officer looked up from her station. "Commander, the approaching vessels have dropped out of hyperspace at the system edge. We're getting identification now." The main display updated, showing 12 large rectangular ships. Their design was blocky and angular, clearly old. The identification markers showed Earth Defense Force, which made Vrax pause. Humans, the newest members of the Galactic Council. Barely 2 centuries since first contact. What were they doing here? "Hail them," Vrax ordered. The communication opened with audio only. No video feed, which was unusual. When the human voice spoke, it sounded calm and professional, almost friendly. "Zerelthian Fleet, this is Colonel Lisa Barnes of the Earth Defense Force. You are ordered to cease your bombardment preparations and withdraw from Carvathi space immediately. This is your only warning." Vrax couldn't help but laugh. The bridge crew joined in. The audacity of it was almost admirable. 12 antique human ships giving orders to a Zerelthian battle fleet. "Human Colonel," Vrax replied. "You are either very brave or very stupid. I have 18 warships, each one capable of reducing your vessels to debris. This is a Zerelthian military operation. You have no authority here. Leave now while I'm still feeling generous." There was a pause on the other end. When Colonel Barnes spoke again, her voice had changed. It was colder, harder, carrying an edge that made Vrax's amusement fade slightly. "Commander, you have 5 minutes to begin withdrawal. If you do not comply, we will use force. You dare threaten me? Humanity has 12 ships. I have 18, and everyone is superior to your outdated technology. This is your last chance. Leave, or I will destroy you and add Earth to my list of conquered worlds." Another pause. Then Colonel Barnes said something that Vrax would remember for the rest of his life. "You're right about one thing. Our ships are outdated, but you're wrong about what's inside them. All Sentinel pilots, you are cleared to deploy. Show them why we were feared." On Vrax's display, the human carrier ships suddenly opened their launch bays. What emerged made him stand up from his command chair in shock. They weren't fighters. They weren't bombers. They were giants. Massive humanoid machines that dropped toward the planet like falling stars. Each one had to be at least 40 or 50 meters tall, covered in armor that glowed red from atmospheric entry. As they fell, they adjusted their positions with maneuvering thrusters clearly under intelligent control. "What are those?" his sensor officer whispered. Vrax had no answer. In 30 years of military service, he had never seen anything like this. The Galactic Council had assured everyone that humanity had sealed away their dangerous weapons. These machines had to be those weapons, and now they were falling toward his ground forces like the wrath of an angry god. On the ground, Zerelthian troops were setting up bombardment coordinates when their sky suddenly filled with falling meteors. The objects hit the ground with impacts that registered on seismic sensors across the continent. Dust and smoke rose from impact craters scattered across the battlefield. When the dust began to clear, the Zerelthian soldiers saw what had landed among them. They were machines, standing taller than any building in the Carvathi settlements. War machines that looked almost human but were clearly built for destruction. Their optical sensors glowed like eyes, scanning the battlefield with inhuman precision. Captain Greg Palmer felt the familiar sensation of his Sentinel systems coming fully online after the drop. All around him were Zerelthian forces, armored vehicles and soldier positions. They were already scrambling, trying to respond to this unexpected threat. He opened a communication channel to all Sentinel units. "Remember, protect the civilians first. Eliminate military targets only. Try to minimize damage to infrastructure. These people have to live here after we're gone." Then he switched to external speakers, broadcasting his voice across the battlefield in translated Zerelthian. "Zerelthian ground forces, this is Captain Palmer of the Earth Defense Force. You are ordered to surrender immediately. Lay down your weapons and you will not be harmed. Resist and we will show you no mercy." For a moment there was silence. Then a Zerelthian commander, either brave or foolish, ordered his forces to open fire. The tanks fired first, their main cannons launching explosive rounds designed to penetrate modern armor. The shells hit Warden 7's composite plating and detonated, creating spectacular explosions that temporarily obscured Greg's view. When the smoke cleared, Warden 7 was standing exactly where it had been, completely undamaged. Greg activated his kinetic cannons, the massive weapons mounted on his Sentinel's shoulders. They fired with a sound like thunder, sending solid projectiles downrange at hypersonic speeds. The Zrelthian tanks exploded, their modern armor useless against weapons that relied on pure kinetic force rather than energy. In 3 seconds, an entire armored column ceased to exist. Around the battlefield, other sentinels were engaging their targets. Lieutenant Kevin Shaw had landed in the middle of a Zrelthian walker battalion. Their walkers were 15 meters tall, equipped with plasma weapons and missile systems. Against any normal opponent, they would have been formidable. Kevin activated Warden 3's plasma blade, a weapon that burned hotter than the surface of a star. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, his sentinel dancing between the enemy walkers like a fighter, instead of a 50-meter-tall war machine. The plasma blade cut through enemy armor like it wasn't there. Within minutes, the entire walker battalion was scrap metal. Sergeant Nicole Hayes took a different approach. Her sentinel, Warden 9, was equipped for long-range support. She positioned herself on a ridge overlooking the main battlefield and began systematically destroying Zrelthian artillery positions. Her targeting systems could track 100 enemies simultaneously. Her missile pods could engage 50 targets at once. Zrelthian fortifications that had taken weeks to build disappeared in seconds. The Zrelthian ground forces had never experienced anything like this. Their weapons were useless. Their armor was meaningless. Their tactics, refined through decades of galactic warfare, accomplished nothing against enemies that didn't follow any rules they understood. The sentinels moved unpredictably, fought aggressively, and seemed to anticipate every move before it happened. What the Zrelthians didn't understand was that each sentinel wasn't controlled by a computer or artificial intelligence. Inside each one was a human being, connected directly through neural interface, thinking and reacting with human speed and creativity. The sentinels didn't follow programmed responses. They improvised, adapted, and fought with the kind of tactical flexibility that only organic intelligence could provide. In orbit, Commander Vrax was watching the battle unfold with growing horror. His ground forces were being destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. The difference was important. In a defeat, soldiers retreated, regrouped. The aftermath of battle was always strange. One moment, everything was chaos and violence. The next, there was just silence and smoke and the weight of what had happened. Captain Greg Palmer kept his sentinel on active alert, scanning for any remaining threats, but the fight was clearly over. The Zrelthians who hadn't fled were surrendering, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in the universal gesture of submission. Around Vareth Prime, the 12 sentinels stood like guardian statues, their weapons still hot from battle. Between them, Karvathi civilians were starting to emerge from underground shelters where they had hidden during the bombardment. They moved cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they realized the danger had passed. Commander Jake Morrison arrived in the horizon 6 hours after the battle ended. His diplomatic vessel had been too slow to participate in the fighting, but he had monitored everything from a safe distance. Now he landed at the main settlement to coordinate with the Karvathi leadership and assess the situation. The settlement's main square had been converted into a temporary command center. Sentinel pilots had dismounted from their machines and were working with Karvathi officials to organize relief efforts. Greg Palmer was easy to spot, still wearing his neural interface suit, talking with a group of Karvathi elders. "Captain Palmer," Jake said, approaching. "That was impressive work. I've never seen anything like it." Greg turned and nodded. "Commander Morrison, glad you could make it. We're coordinating evacuation schedules right now. Most of the civilians want to stay, but some of the settlements took damage. We're setting up temporary housing and medical stations." "What about casualties?" Jake asked quietly. "On our side, none. The Sentinels performed perfectly. On the Karvathi side, we lost about 300 civilians in the initial bombardment before we arrived. Could have been much worse, 300 lives." Jake felt the weight of that number. If they had arrived just an hour earlier, maybe those people would still be alive. But if they hadn't come at all, 60,000 people would be dead. "The Zrelthian prisoners?" Jake asked. "About 800 soldiers surrendered. We've got them secured in their own base camps. They're surprisingly cooperative. I think they're in shock. Their commanders told them humans were weak and inexperienced. They weren't expecting sentinels. One of the Karvathi elders, an older female named Shara, approached them. Her species was tall and slender, with silver skin that seemed to shimmer in the light. Her eyes were large and filled with tears. "Commander Morrison," she said in accented English. Captain Palmer, on behalf of my people, I must thank you. The council abandoned us. They sent words but no help. You sent warriors and salvation. Jake felt uncomfortable with the praise. We did what anyone should do. We heard your distress call and we responded. But the others did not respond, Shara said softly. The council talked while we prepared to die. Only humanity acted. This will not be forgotten. Over the next several days, the full scale of what had happened began to spread across the galaxy. Ships that had witnessed the battle sent reports. Survivors transmitted recordings. News networks across hundreds of worlds reported the same story. Humanity had deployed ancient war machines to save a species the Council had ignored. The reaction was complicated. Some species were grateful, seeing humanity as heroes who had done the right thing. Others were frightened, suddenly realizing that the friendly humans who had joined the Council 2 centuries ago had been hiding terrifying military capability. A few were angry, claiming humanity had violated treaties and acted without authorization. The Galactic Council called an emergency session 3 days after the battle. Every major species sent representatives to the Council Station, a massive orbital platform that served as the seat of galactic government. The chamber could hold thousands, and today it was packed. Ambassador Peter Collins represented humanity. He was a career diplomat who had spent 30 years building relationships with alien species. He believed in peace and cooperation, in solving problems through conversation. But he also believed that sometimes words weren't enough. The Velnari counselor spoke first, her voice sharp with accusation. Humanity has violated the Treaty of Mars. You agreed to seal away your weapons of mass destruction. These sentinels were supposed to be decommissioned. Peter stood calmly at his podium. We agreed to seal them away. We did exactly that. They've been in storage for 234 years. The treaty specified that we would not use them in wars of aggression or territorial expansion. We did not violate that clause. You deployed weapons without council authorization, another counselor argued. The council was debating. Peter replied, his voice harder now. 60,000 civilians were about to die while you formed committees and scheduled votes. We didn't have time to wait for authorization. We had time to act or watch people die. We chose to act. The Thros ambassador, a massive being covered in natural armor plates, rumbled his agreement. The human speaks truth. The council failed the Carvathi. We talked of principles while they prepared funeral rites. At least humanity has the courage to match their words with actions. Courage? The Velnari counselor hissed. Or recklessness? These sentinels are abominations. War machines controlled by individual consciousness. They're too dangerous to exist. Peter looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many representatives as he could. You want to talk about dangerous? You know what's dangerous? Watching innocent people die because it's politically inconvenient to help them. You know what's dangerous? A galaxy where sending a distress call is meaningless because no one will answer. He pulled up a holographic display showing the battle footage. The room watched in silence as sentinels fought to protect Carvathi civilians. They saw Greg Palmer's sentinel standing between a residential area and advancing Zrelthian forces. Taking fire meant for homes and families. They saw Nicole Hayes carefully targeting military positions while avoiding civilian structures. They saw Kevin Shaw pulling survivors from collapsed buildings with mechanical hands capable of crushing tanks, but gentle enough to hold children. These machines aren't abominations, Peter said quietly. They're tools, and more importantly, they're controlled by people who believe in protecting the innocent. Every pilot in those sentinels had a choice. They could have stayed in suspended animation. They could have refused the mission. Instead, they woke up after 2 centuries of sleep and immediately volunteered to risk their lives for people they'd never met. The Carvathi representative stood, her voice trembling with emotion. My people vote in favor of humanity. They saved us when no one else would. If that is wrong, then we choose to be wrong with them. The debate continued for hours. Some species supported humanity's actions. Others condemned them. But slowly a consensus began to form. Not agreement, but understanding. Humanity had acted outside normal channels, yes. They had deployed weapons that frightened many species, true. But they had also saved 60,000 lives that would otherwise have been lost. The final vote was close but clear. Humanity would not be sanctioned. However, they would be required to register all legacy military assets with the Council. The Sentinels would remain operational, but only for defensive purposes and humanitarian intervention. Any aggressive use would result in immediate expulsion from the Council and potential military action. Peter accepted the terms, knowing they were the best humanity could hope for. As the session ended and representatives filed out, several approached him privately to express quiet support. The public debate might have been contentious, but privately, many species were grateful someone had finally acted. Back on Verith Prime, Captain Greg Palmer was helping Carvathi engineers repair damaged infrastructure. His Sentinel strength made short work of moving heavy debris and lifting structural supports into place. It was strange, using a weapon of war for construction work, but it felt right somehow. A young Carvathi engineer named Dren worked alongside him, directing the Sentinel's movements. "Captain, can I ask you something?" "Sure," Greg replied through external speakers. "Why did you come? Your species barely knows ours. We've never traded or formed alliances. You had no obligation to help us." Greg was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. "Where I come from, there's an old saying. It goes, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. We heard your distress call. We had the ability to help. If we had done nothing, we wouldn't be good people anymore. Does that make sense?" Dren nodded slowly. "I think so. You helped because it was the right thing to do." "Exactly. That seems so simple." "It is simple," Greg agreed. "People try to make it complicated with politics and regulations and debates about jurisdiction. But at the core, it's simple. Someone needed help. We provided help. That's all." That evening, the Sentinel pilots gathered in their temporary quarters. They were exhausted, not from the battle itself, but from the aftermath. Helping coordinate relief efforts, dealing with prisoners and repairing damage was draining in a different way than combat. Lieutenant Kevin Shaw stretched out on a bunk that was too small for his tall frame. "So what do you think happens now? Do we go back to sleep for another 200 years? "Don't know," Greg admitted. "Command hasn't told us anything definitive." The recordings from Verith Prime spread through the galactic network like wildfire. Everyone wanted to see the battle where ancient human war machines had defeated a modern military force. The footage was analyzed, debated, and shared billions of times across thousands of worlds. Some viewers were amazed, others were terrified, but everyone was talking about humanity. The Zrelthian Empire's reaction was immediate and severe. Commander Vrax the Merciless was stripped of his rank and exiled for losing to what the Empire considered an inferior force. The entire military command structure was reorganized. More importantly, the Empire quietly began withdrawing from several border conflicts, suddenly less confident in their military superiority. Captain Greg Palmer and his fellow Sentinel pilots stayed on Verith Prime for 2 weeks, helping with reconstruction efforts. The Carvathi people treated them like heroes, offering gifts and gratitude at every opportunity. Children would gather around the Sentinels when they were powered down, drawing pictures on the armor plating with chalk. On the 15th day, orders came from Earth Command. The Sentinels were to return to Luna, but they would not be returning to suspended animation. Instead, they would remain on active duty, ready to deploy if needed. The galaxy had changed, and humanity's role in it had changed too. The night before departure, the Carvathi held a ceremony in the main settlement square. Thousands gathered to say farewell to the humans who had saved them. Elder Shara spoke, her voice carried by speakers so everyone could hear. "We are a peaceful people," she said. "We have always believed that violence was never the answer, that all conflicts could be resolved through understanding and compassion. The Zrelthians taught us we were wrong. Some beings do not understand peace. They only understand strength." She gestured to the 12 Sentinels standing at the edge of the square, their armor cleaned and repaired, looking like ancient statues. Humanity showed us that strength and compassion are not opposites. They showed us that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. We will never forget this lesson. We will never forget humanity's courage. Greg listened from his Sentinel's cockpit, feeling uncomfortable with so much praise. They had just done what needed doing. But he understood that for the Carvathi, this was about more than one battle. It was about hope, about knowing that someone in the galaxy cared enough to help. The return journey to Earth took 5 days. The carrier vessels traveled at a more leisurely pace, giving everyone time to rest and process what had happened. Greg spent most of the trip reading reports about the galactic reaction to their mission. The news was mixed. Several peaceful species had expressed support for humanity's actions. The Thros had formally proposed a mutual defense pact with Earth. The Delani had invited human diplomats to discuss increased trade. But other species were wary, increasing their military budgets and watching human space with nervous attention. The Galactic Council had passed new regulations requiring advance notice before deploying weapons like Sentinels. Humanity had agreed to register all military assets and provide transparency about their capabilities. It was a compromise, but one that let humanity keep their guardians active. When they finally arrived at Luna, Greg expected a quiet return to duty. Instead, they found a crowd waiting. Thousands of humans had gathered at the public observation areas, holding signs and cheering. News crews from dozens of networks were present. The Sentinel pilots had become celebrities. President Linda Martinez was waiting in the secure briefing room. She stood as the pilots entered, still wearing their neural interface suits. "Gentlemen, ladies, welcome home. You've made humanity proud." "Thank you, Madam President," Greg replied. "We just did our duty." "You did more than that. You reminded the galaxy who we are. For 200 years we've been careful, diplomatic, trying to fit in. You reminded them that we're also capable of great courage and great strength when it matters." She gestured to chairs around a conference table. "Sit, please. We need to discuss what comes next." The briefing lasted 3 hours. The president explained the new protocols for Sentinel deployment, the political situation with various galactic factions, and humanity's evolving role in galactic affairs. The most important revelation came near the end. "We're forming a rapid response force," President Martinez said, "a dedicated unit built around the Sentinels with supporting craft and personnel. Your mission will be simple. Answer distress calls that the Council can't or won't respond to. You'll be humanity's promise to the galaxy. When someone needs help, we'll be there." Greg exchanged glances with his fellow pilots. This was more than they had expected, not just remaining active but becoming a permanent force for humanitarian intervention. "This will make some species nervous," Lieutenant Kevenshaw pointed out. "I know," the president acknowledged, "but it will also give hope to others. And frankly, the galaxy needs to understand that humanity takes its obligations seriously. We're not going to sit quietly while innocent people die." Over the following months, the Rapid Response Force took shape. It was officially called the Humanitarian Intervention Corps, though everyone just called it the Sentinel Guard. Besides the original 12 pilots, 30 more were awakened from suspended animation and trained. New carrier vessels were built, faster and better equipped. Support crews were assembled from volunteers across the military. Commander Jake Morrison was offered command of the Diplomatic Coordination Branch. He accepted, seeing it as a way to combine his skills with the new reality of humanity's role. His job was to work with alien governments, coordinate with the Council, and identify situations where the Sentinel Guard might be needed. The first test came 6 months after Vareth Prime. A mining colony in the frontier reaches sent a distress call. A criminal organization had seized the colony and was holding workers hostage, demanding ransom from multiple governments. The local authorities were overwhelmed, and the Galactic Council was debating what level of force was appropriate. Jake received the distress call and immediately contacted the Sentinel Guard. Within 4 hours, 2 Sentinels and a support team were on their way. Another 8 hours later, the crisis was resolved. The criminals surrendered when they saw what they were facing. Not a single hostage was harmed. The second deployment came 3 months after that. A natural disaster on a developing world had trapped thousands in collapsed underground shelters. Local rescue equipment couldn't move the debris fast enough. The Sentinels arrived and used their strength to lift massive concrete slabs and steel beams, working around the clock until every survivor was rescued. By the end of the first year, the Sentinel Guard had deployed 7 times. Not all were combat situations. Sometimes they provided disaster relief. Sometimes they evacuated civilians from war zones. Once they helped build emergency housing for refugees. Each mission reinforced the same message. Humanity would answer when called. The galaxy's perception of humanity began to shift. They were no longer seen as just the newest members of the galactic community. They became known as the species that kept its promises, that valued life above politics, that would cross the stars to help strangers. Not everyone liked this reputation. Some species saw it as interference. Others worried about humanity becoming too powerful. But most species, especially the smaller and more vulnerable ones, quietly appreciated knowing that someone was watching, that someone would help if needed. Greg Palmer found himself becoming the public face of the Sentinel Guard. He gave interviews, attended ceremonies, and spoke at military academies across human space. He always said the same thing: "We're not heroes. We're just people who refuse to look away when others are suffering." 5 years after Verith Prime, Greg stood in the same Luna hangar where everything had begun. New Sentinels had been built, incorporating lessons learned from recent deployments. Younger pilots were training on the older models, learning the skills they would need. Director Helen Price walked over, now retired but still visiting the facility regularly. "Quite a change from 5 years ago, isn't it?" Greg nodded. "Back then, I thought we'd do one mission and go back to sleep. Instead, we started something bigger." "You did. The Sentinel Guard has become what humanity needed it to be. Not conquerors, not warriors looking for glory, just guardians who show up when they're needed." "Do you think it will last?" Greg asked. "Or will the galaxy eventually decide we're too dangerous and force us to seal the Sentinels away again?" Helen smiled. "I think as long as we keep using them the right way for the right reasons, we'll be fine. The galaxy might fear our weapons, but they respect our choices. We could use the Sentinels to conquer. We could use them to intimidate. Instead, we use them to protect. That means something." That evening, Jake Morrison met with Ambassador Peter Collins in Earth's orbital diplomatic station. They were reviewing requests for assistance, trying to prioritize which situations needed Sentinel response. "We've got a request from a cargo vessel dealing with space pirates," Jake said. "Another from a colony experiencing severe food shortages. And this one is interesting. A diplomatic delegation is trapped on a neutral station due to factional fighting. None of the sides will agree to a ceasefire." Peter studied the reports. "The pirate situation is straightforward.